Just another minute. So my name is Karen Hangartner, and I am the Director of Professional Services at the National Children's Advocacy Center. And this webinar today is brought to you by our Southern Regional Children's Advocacy Center project. And I'm just really excited to be able to bring you this webinar. I don't know that there's ever been a more important time that we're having this conversation and about the intersections of secondary traumatic stress with racism, historical trauma, and other systems of oppression. And so we have some fabulous presenters here with us today. And Alison Hendricks has been a dear friend of Southern Regional for a long time now, and she's kind of taken the lead to getting our panel together with us. And then we've got Sandra Chase, Shannon CrossBear, and Carmon Rosa Noroña that are going to be presenting for us today. And so I'm thrilled to have you here. Just a couple of housekeeping things. You're going to see a Q&A box. So we really encourage you throughout the presentation, go ahead and put some questions in there for the panelists. We're going to have about 90 minutes of presentations, and then we will have time for Q&A. So go ahead and open that Q&A box and feel free to start populating that with questions for our presenters afterwards. And so Caroline, if you'll advance the slide. This is our notice from our federal funders that this webinar is supported by our agreement and from our funders at OJJDP. And these views are ours and those of the panelists and do not represent OJJDP. So with that out of the way, it is kind of like, why does this matter for children's advocacy centers? And I think if nothing else, if recent events tells us that what's happening within our culture, within our society, I really do believe plays out on our multidisciplinary teams associated with our CACs. And so it's like our MDTs are almost like a microcosm. And so I think what we've seen in the last couple of years is that oftentimes whatever's going on in our communities with, racial injustice, historical trauma, it's showing up in our teams. And I think the other thing that really matters is that this impacts our CAC staff, especially those from historically marginalized populations. And it is different to be, from one of those populations working within these systems when you also see a lot of the gaps and the holes in the systems. And we need to better understand where some of the risk factors are for our CAC staff, for our MDT members in developing in secondary traumatic stress. And while there's not a whole lot of information and research around this intersection of STS and historical trauma, man, oh man, we have to assume it's playing out in very real ways for our folks, and it's showing up in our CACs. And again, because I do believe what's happening in our communities play out within our MDTs, I think it can kind of shine the light on what conflict and what behaviors we're seeing. And so it's just an incredibly important conversation. And I'm thrilled that we have over 240 people that are here for the conversation today. So Alison, at this time, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being here and coordinating all this for us so that we can learn from you all today.
Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you everyone for being here. Welcome. I will introduce myself and get us started. But before we do that, we just kind of wanted to acknowledge, we know that there's been so much going on in the news. And so just kind of take a moment, take some deep breaths, some thoughts for especially the immigrants, the situation that was found in the truck in Texas, and all the immigrants that were found, and all the losses and all the trauma that we experience every day in our work. Just to take a moment to kind of reflect on that as we get started and talking about some of these intersections and how difficult it can be. So my name is Alison Hendricks. I'm a licensed clinical social worker based here in San Diego. I am a trainer and consultant, an affiliate member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and co-chair of the Secondary Traumatic Stress Collaborative Group of the NCTSN. And I do work with Karen on the STS consortium, as well as I'm also involved in some other STS related grants. So I'm really happy to be here with you today. I'm going to let my esteemed colleagues introduce themselves as they come on. We wanted to just review briefly the learning objectives for today. So we first wanted to start talking about secondary trauma, and that really is the indirect exposure when we work with individuals, children, families who've been exposed to trauma, and we are exposed to the trauma through their stories, through the impact that we see on them and how that can affect us. And that is the secondary traumatic stress reactions, the distress, the emotions, the reactions that can bring up when we're exposed to the trauma of others. We're also going to talk about ethno-racial trauma and historical trauma more specifically. We really want to gain more of an understanding how when we are exposed to work-related trauma, how that can intersect with racism, historical trauma, systems of oppression. So if you are a provider who comes to the work with a marginalized identity, you may experience some of the same trauma as the clients that you work with, and their traumas can have even more of a strong impact if that relates to your own experience. So we're going to talk a lot about those intersections, and then we're also going to talk about strategies. So what can you do as an individual? What can supervisors do to support their workers? And what can organizations do? And what must organizations do to address these intersections and really provide that support to all staff, including and especially those who may hold marginalized identities and may be at higher risk for secondary traumatic stress. Next slide, please. So why is this important? And I think, Karen already kind of set the stage and acknowledged that in child advocacy work, and those of you in related professionals who work in the field of child abuse, and really any child or family serving setting, we know that there is significant trauma, and sometimes it's really severe trauma. And we know that working in this field exposes us to that trauma. It really is an occupational hazard. And regardless of your role, whether you're an interviewer, an advocate, a case manager, an administrative staff, a supervisor, a director, it will affect you, because working in trauma-exposed workplace, we're all exposed to the trauma, and it does have an impact. We also want to acknowledge, and we'll talk in a moment about some of the other workplace stressors that can really exacerbate the secondary trauma reactions. And acknowledging that many of us come to this work and come to this field with our own trauma. And that can be historical trauma. That can also be childhood trauma. That can be current ongoing trauma. It may be trauma related to discrimination, racial trauma. So we really want to understand how that can increase our risk of secondary trauma if we are coming to the work or have our own current or past history of trauma. How that might be triggered when we work with clients and families who also have trauma, especially if it's similar types of trauma. We know that if we fail to address secondary trauma, the results can be very problematic. That can really affect our work performance, the quality of our work. It also can lead to lack of job satisfaction, turnover. So we know, especially with in the last few years with the pandemic, turnover rates and staff shortages have been such a problem across the country. And we also just look at quality of life. We really need to care for our workforce, and their wellness is really important to our work. If you're not well, you're not able to help others. And we do see that STS can affect mental health, physical health. We really want to acknowledge that if we don't address secondary trauma, especially at the organizational level, people will suffer, their work will suffer, and they will leave, and it will lead to more stress on the organization. Next slide, please. So this is just a visual depiction of the fact that we all have a lot of different stressors. So we already talked about the indirect trauma. So that is the secondary traumatic stress, again, working with individuals who have trauma and how that impacts us. And we also had already talked about the direct exposure, how many of us have our own traumas, whether it's current or past or historical. And also that might include ethno-racial trauma. So if you are a person who holds a marginalized identity, or you're a person of color, you may experience racial trauma on an ongoing basis, even microaggressions within your own organizations or in your own work. We also think of what we call empathic strain, which has also been called the cost of caring. So when you're in a helping profession and you're helping others who are in distress, how that can be exhausting if you're feeling like that you're giving and kind of surrounded by a lot of people in distress. That distress can really wear on you as a provider. We also want to acknowledge personal circumstances. So especially thinking about in the last 2 years, I know a lot of us have had a lot of various stressors, whether it's at family, trying to take care of children, trying to take care of parents, personal health issues, personal health concerns with COVID. So that all can kind of intersect and make it more difficult to deal with the trauma exposure that we experience in our work. We also, many of us have had work-related traumatic loss or grief. So whether that is the death of a client or a colleague, the loss of being face-to-face and having that team support that we can be so helpful. Also looking at working conditions, is your workplace safe, both physically and psychologically? Are there other stressful working conditions or things about the work that you do? If you have to work in the field, are there dangers or risks related to that work? And then what we talk about, systems failure. So knowing that, especially those of you in child advocacy centers and many of us, work with different systems. We intersect, we work with the courts, we work with law enforcement, we work with child welfare. That is part of the multidisciplinary team and the different systems that we work with. Unfortunately, when you're part of that, you don't always have total control over the decisions that are made. And sometimes decisions come down that you may not agree with. And that can create what we call moral distress. If one part of the system makes a decision that you feel is against your beliefs or values, or you feel like puts a child at risk, and that yet you have to kind of still be part of that system and part of that decision. I was just reading the child welfare news about a recent case in Sacramento of a father during a supervised visit that killed his children. And it was court ordered that he had visitation. And even though it was supervised, this still happened. And the mother had been arguing over and over that this was not a safe situation. And I'm guessing social workers and other advocates might also have been arguing and yet that decision was made. So those kind of situations obviously can really wear heavy on us. And then we have been talking about the sociocultural context. So much has been going on. So whether it's in your direct community, in your state, in our country, these events really affect us all. So when you hear on the news about another mass shooting, especially related to a hate crime and racially based, when you hear about children being shot at school, this just adds to our load and really can make it, again, more difficult to deal with the stress of working in trauma exposed individuals, knowing that we have all of these different stressors that may be weighing on us all at the same time. So with that, we're going to do a brief poll just to kind of check in with you all and for you to check in with yourself. One of the strategies that we talk about in dealing with secondary trauma is understanding the sources of stress and what's really getting to you the most. And that self-awareness is really helpful. So we're going to ask you to answer the question, which of the following do you feel is currently contributing the most to your current stress level? So you're going to choose one, and then we'll get a chance to see kind of what has been weighing most heavily on you all lately. Just a reminder again, your responses are confidential, so nobody will see your response. We'll just see the averages. So as soon as we have a pretty high percentage of people voting, Meredith, you're welcome to close the poll and share the results. All right, so it looks like quite a mix. So we have our highest is personal circumstances. So just a lot of the stressful situations that are going on, understandable. Indirect work-related trauma, or STS, being the number 3, systems failure being number 2, sociocultural issues being number 2, systems failure. Yeah. So thank you all for sharing. And again, it might just be helpful to pay attention on an ongoing basis when there's so much at the same time. You know, what's really getting to me the most? Because then that can help us understand, okay, so that's maybe the area that, you know, I can focus on and be aware of what's upsetting me, and then looking for what I can do as far as, you know, what are my supports, anything that we can do to address that. Obviously, we're not, unfortunately, going to be able to stop all the bad things that go on in the world in the news, but really, again, kind of taking stock and thinking about what can we do. And we'll talk a little later about our call to action and what we can do as advocates, both for ourselves and for the greater community. All right, next slide, please. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Shannon to get us talking about historical trauma.
Thanks, Alison. Anin minagishigak nakishnakas wabuganis indue maganak. I just wanted to greet you all in my language. My English name is Shannon CrossBear, and I'm coming to you from the homelands of the Ojibwe people on Lake Superior. I'm glad to be with you and have this important conversation. So, you know, even part of my being able to greet you in my language is a part of my restorative process around historical trauma. So, you know, we hear that term a lot, historical trauma, but what really does that mean, right? How does that affect us? And sometimes we think it doesn't affect us because we don't come from a particular group that name has been associated with. But I want you just to keep in mind that it really is kind of this cumulative psychological wounding that happens across generations, including your own lifespan, and which really emanates from a massive group trauma. So imagine in the future that this historical trauma of the experience that we're having right now will impact a future generation. So just thinking about all of this history that we bring with us, everybody came into the room today, you all bring a history with you. And that history, you know, oftentimes brings trauma, whether acknowledged or unacknowledged trauma, and that has an effect. And it's really interesting, you know, and I know Sandra will be talking a little bit about this later, about what we're finding out about historical trauma and how that actually does get moved from generation to generation on a biological basis, as well as in some different ways. And I find it interesting because in our communities, we've often talked about this as blood memory. And now we're finding out from a Western construct that indeed there is blood memory that is within our DNA and within our cells that carries this forward. So, so we have, when we think about all of these intersects, and of all of the peoples and the communities, these are things that we're bringing into that conversation with us. And we have some very specific ways that shows up. So if you can imagine just your own experiences, maybe that you have in your daily work with trauma exposure, and imagine that you're putting that on top of that accumulative effect over time and what that means. So next slide, please. So, you know, when we talk about kind of historical trauma and we think about specifically about American Indian, Alaskan Native, we think about all of those things back to the genocide, to the disease and starvation, to the physical and sexual violence, the forced removal, the boarding schools. And maybe some of you have heard a little bit about that in the news in the past year. But imagine even how the conversation of that revisiting that, being able to actually have that come up again begins to affect the population. So I often think about, these are kind of all of the biggies in the room, so to speak, that we talk about: separation of families. We think about the criminals being criminally affected because we couldn't even practice our faith in a country that was built on religious freedoms. But I think the other historical trauma that we often don't talk about really has to do with invisibility. So with American Indian, Alaskan Native population, we've been invisible, in the history books, in people's lives. I mean, still to this day, most people have no idea that there's over 527 federally recognized tribes, nation states within the boundaries of the US. And so thinking about just kind of being present, but not present, and what effect that has in terms of not only the identification of trauma, but also being able then to know how that affects on an ongoing basis. And I'll talk a little bit later about that. But I'm gonna, next slide, we're gonna pass this on to Sandra to talk about, kind of continue this conversation.
Happy Thursday, and thank you for the opportunity. It's certainly an honor and a privilege to be with you all today. I want to thank Karen and Alison, who described all the different layers that I have experienced trauma. Sharon for giving us perspective in all of the different ways that the country in general, our history has been traumatic. My background, I'm from Phoenix, Arizona originally, and I share that because that gives you context. I am in Los Angeles, California. I'm an affiliate, such as Alison, with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and the co-chair of the Cultural Consortium Race and Trauma Subcommittee, and the Anti-Racist Faculty. I say all that because it gives you context in my journey and my perspective. To Alison's point, so I started my career as a child abuse investigator in Arizona, in Phoenix, Arizona, right? So most of the families that I interacted with did not look like me. And by virtue of why I was there, they didn't want to see me, and they certainly didn't want to see me as an African-American woman when I showed up at their door, in the court, at the schools. So just to give you some background, and that in itself, that work is traumatic. Believe me, and I'm sure there are many on the calls that worked in child welfare. That in itself is very, very traumatic. So going back on, kind of piggybacking on Sharon, looking at historical trauma and slavery. So some of you in the poll said you were impacted by social cultural trauma. That's based in history. So I just wanted to, that is actually based in history. And I know Carmon is going to help clarify that a little more, but think about the journey of African Americans and, like we say, Native American. So we were brought here as chattel slavery, and sold as commodities, were considered as valuable as cattle and sheep. We were separated on the journey, which many actually didn't make the journey because some chose to, in chains, end it right there. So much so that there are some surveys, there's some research that says it changed the pattern of sharks, because in making
Hello,
that
everybody.
journey.
Welcome back to Making Waves Conversations with Influencers.
So we're
and
getting some
Disruptors
feedback
every
from
Wednesday
somewhere.
here at
I don't know where
4
that's
o'clock
coming
on
from.
Facebook Live and live on our Zoominar.
We're
I'm
getting
thrilled
some.
that we're 9 weeks
I'm aware of that. I'm not
Yes,
sure
thank
where
you,
it's coming from.
everybody.
One
We
second.
really appreciate the letters that you've sent us. And
I'll
the
let you
ideas
I'll let
for
you figure
guests,
that out
please keep
for a
those
moment.
coming.
Yeah, hold on just
Today,
one
I
minute while
want
we
to
figure it
welcome
out.
Dr. Wisdom
Absolutely.
Powell, and she is the director of the Health Disparities Institute and a
Got it? All right, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to, again, think about the journey, just the journey. So we are, African Americans are the descendants of those who made it, which is incredible, just to think about that. And we look at slavery, family separation, abuse and torture, humiliation, segregation, Jim Crow laws, lynching, violence, and that's all in me, right? I don't necessarily live in trauma, but trauma lives in me. And so we'll talk a little bit about epigenetics, but I guess when we think about healing, we can't really address healing until we acknowledge we've been wounded, right? That we've all been wounded because we are all, as my mentor, Dr. Joy DeGrusse, talks about, we're all infected and we all been affected. So let us go to the video with, okay, are we, okay. So the Howard Stevens is not next, right? Okay, I'm going to pass it on to Carmon Rosa, but let me just mention mass incarceration. And collectively, people of color, our axology is relationship based. It's collective, is relationship based. So when we see things like Alison mentioned, of the immigrants, 53 that died, when we see George Floyd, Tamir Rice, Breonna Taylor, in my mind, that's my uncle, that's my sister, that's my daughter. I feel it collectively. And people of color often say, and I know this is true for African American, when things happen and there's a perpetrator, almost the first thing on my mind is, I hope it wasn't a Black person. Why? Because I know that reflects on me. So we're collective, we're relationship based. What I see affects me on the news, whether I'm driving down the street and I see men pulled over, young boys of color, I feel it collectively. Carmen?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Carmon Rosa Noroña, and I am originally from Ecuador. I locate myself as a cisgender mestiza woman. I am an infant and early childhood mental health worker and social worker who inhabits in the borderlands of binationality, bilingualism, and intersectionality. When I think about historical trauma, I am thinking about the impact of colonization and racism in all the Americas, right? In Latin America, particularly. My first encounter with the impact of historical trauma was in my own country, and then as an immigrant, I have witnessed firsthand the reproduction or the modern echoes of historical trauma and its impact on immigrant children, particularly very young children who were separated from their parents, who are affected by racialized immigration policies that are targeted to particular groups of immigrants that happen to be the immigrants who were mostly affected in their own countries by colonization, by racism, and then also by the massacres that were financed by external governments in their countries, which are also reproductions of historical trauma. And the graph that I am presenting to you here is important because it is a way of understanding how historical trauma has an impact on child-parent relationships and how also affects all of us in society. So this graph actually is based on the work of Sotero, and who is a person or a scientist that has looked at historical trauma from a public health perspective. So we have talked about the historical trauma experience. So is the exposure of a group based on specific membership criteria, ethnic, racial, nationality, or religious, to the deliberate perpetration of massive trauma. And the expression of that massive trauma can exist on a continuum, as we have been discussing, that includes experiences of colonialism, systematic discrimination, and to political violence, genocide, and generations of structural inequality. And so when we think about the historical trauma experience, it is enabled by societal structures, by laws, language, culture. And that has an impact on a particular group, yes, the target group that I was mentioning, but also on those who are reproducing those systems of oppression on one hand, so the perpetrators, and then also the bystanders, so those who might feel that they are not responsible for the injuries, but that they are just watching or not being informed of or aware of how these traumas are continue to impact generations of children, and of BIPOC children, and then also of just everyone in a country, in this case, in the United States. So for the targeted groups, so when I think about the families that I work with, who are indigenous families from Latin America, that historical trauma response that affects their psychological, physical, relational well-being is transmitted to their children. And Sandra is going to talk more about that at a very at the DNA level, yes. And then also it is transmitted, as I was mentioning, through relationships. So by sometimes patterns of neglect or patterns of hurtful behaviors towards the children. If we think about how a person who is constantly afraid for their life, how can they be present or respond to the cues of their kids if they live in a constant state of fear? And then one of the most sad and insignificant aspects that I have seen in my work is the impact of internalized oppression, and how at times parents reject their children because of the color of their skin, because of the texture of their hair, because of, in my case, of their indigenous features, and how that is the result of internalized oppression. So when we are thinking about patterns of neglect or rejection, we have to think of how that responds again to centuries of of the continuation of injustice and racial trauma that now is manifested in child-parent relationships. And for those who of us who have privilege, thanks to some of our identities, and we are not aware of that privilege, and we think that we are not participants of the continuation of these historical or these echoes of historical trauma, a way of continuing those patterns of intergenerational transmission of trauma is unrecognized privilege.
Mhm.
So here, I want to highlight the importance of engaging in critical self-reflection about our responsibility and how our values, beliefs, our own history sometimes prevents us from seeing how we are contributing to liberation or to oppression. Next slide, please. So historic and intergenerational trauma is a legacy of chronic trauma and unresolved grief across generations, as it has been mentioned. And the research indicates that, as I was also mentioning, that it has a direct impact on relationships in a family, in communities, in a nation, in how children learn and develop cognitively, on attachment relationships, as I was mentioning, on our immune system, on the continuation of patterns of violence in society and at the fabric of a society in families, on the continuation also in the exacerbation of mental health disorders like PTSD, depression, suicide, and others. Next slide, please. Sandra.
Hi. Okay, thank you, Carmen. And although I can't, I haven't read all of the chat, I know there are a lot of feelings. And what I know about this work, this conversation, it's difficult. It is difficult. And it could be traumatic to some because we're all impacted differently and this lands on us differently. What we know is that we inherited these systems. So this is not about shame, blame, or guilt. These are the systems that we all inherited and are still trying to navigate. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Epigenetics is an interesting study of research. I've had the privilege to kind of study Dr. Rachel Yahuda, who is one of the pioneers of the work. And what the research says is, so I think, Sharon, you call it blood memories, which I think is a great name, and I honor that name. And in Western society, they're calling it epigenetics. So it's a study of changes in the expression of the genes that do not result from altercations in the sequence of the genes, but in the way the genes, the genetic codes are read. Each person, their DNA lays groundwork for the development of our physical and psychological characteristics, but the activity of genes can be modified by various factors: life, experiences, and trauma. Scientists who work in epigenetics explore the mechanisms that affect the activity of the genes and how they're read. Recent research on epigenetic changes resulting from trauma can be passed on from one generation to another. So there was some research done by Dr. Carrie Ressler some years ago, and some of you may be familiar with that they programmed, that they used mice. They sprayed a cherry scent and shocked them in the foot as they ran through the maze. They sprayed the cherry scent, they shocked them in the maze. They allowed the mice to mate. The second generation of mice were put through the maze, no shock, but they smelled the cherry scent and would go a different direction. Now, we know that the parent mice did not have conversations with their pups. Inherently, something changed. The second generation mice were able to mate, and their descendants, they did not like a cherry smell. When they smelled it, they would go the opposite. So the research is really becoming clearer and clearer that something happens with trauma. Something changes inherently in the cells that can live on and be passed on from generation to generation. Now, this certainly can be mitigated by all the promotive and protective factors that culture has to offer, the stories, the healing. I was telling the group, growing up in Arizona and in the middle of the civil rights movement, I read everything, but I had dreams of things that I had never witnessed that haunted me. And I believe that that's a part of epigenetics and why often that we are so often triggered and don't understand, what is this about? It could be epigenetics. It could be the collective experience of pain. So I want to think of, when you think of the work, think of it in that respect. This is why we may react when a client that comes in that looks like us, or we've seen something on the news. I can only give what I have, right? And if my vessel is leaking and is not full because of my own experience, of a collective experience, that's how I'm going to show up. This is why this work, this webinar, and bringing this up is so critical. Okay, next slide, please. Sharon. You're muted.
Thanks. Thanks. Thanks, Sandra. When I was listening and thinking about that, just as I'm sitting here now, I was thinking, sometimes when we hear information like that in terms of that historical trauma being passed down and actually being in our DNA, that it can feel disheartening. But the thing that I thought of right away was, if we know that those kinds of negative responses, or what might be perceived as a negative response, happens through that, might it not also be true that our resiliency is passed down?
Absolutely.
So thinking about our strengths as well as, how that, to really think about the trauma, that we've all experienced, and how long, how far removed our cultural experiences from that as well. So how many generations? There's a lot that we don't quite know yet. And then the other thing that I was thinking about was when, Carmon was talking and thinking about, well, how does all of that then show up today, right? How does that show up? And specifically, I've got a couple of kind of these recent more recent kind of focused traumas, so definitely, when we all look at the experience of this pandemic, but it certainly is not the first pandemic. But for certain populations that are closer to an experience that they've had, it kind of regenerates, in a different way. So I think about for our communities, especially in our, communities of color, and certainly in our tribal communities, we're very hard hit with COVID. And when you have a fragile population and you add another threat to that fragile, we lost a lot of our elders and kind of our knowledge keepers. So we were losing much more than just the physical relationships and the beings that we had. We were losing some real historical knowledge and from our elders. And so when we think about, just kind of even how does it show up, the experience of the boarding schools, for example, as a historical trauma, of children being taken away from their families and being put in the boarding schools, many of them dying. What does that have to do with parenting today? Well, I'm just kind of, these things were happening up until the 1970s. So, people my age are definitely affected, and our generations. But imagine that you grew up in an unnatural family setting, such as a boarding school, and where there was a lot of sexual abuse. And then you go on to have your children. Never having heard "I love you" in any other context except a sexual abuse context. So now you have children that you're raising that you don't show that affection to, that you don't say those things to. And now we're a third generation down. So these kinds of, this kind of reclamation, this kind of damage, this kind of trauma, then it, you know, shows up in the way that we're intersecting with children and with their families. So the things like the murdered and missing Indigenous women, when you grow up with that in your mind and you know that you're at a higher risk or that your relatives are at higher risk, just kind of all of that kind of cumulative things. And even though you may not, you should say that you're doing a history, you may not get that history right then and there with that family that you're working with, but we're not only talking about the families that we're working with. We're talking about your coworkers, those of you on multidisciplinary teams that are bringing in these histories with you and maybe even experiencing those things on a daily basis. So just being able to really think about how important this is. And we know that these things are happening and that they haven't stopped. And there's, you know, all of this is continuing. So within the context of what's happening now, cumulatively with what's happened, what continues to happen. And so, you know, I'm gonna kind of just bounce that back to Sandra to talk about kind of from her perspective and kind of what's happening, because these are, we're not, at least I'm not here to kind of go with that framework of, you know, everything is bad or everybody has to compete for how painful this is. This is painful for all of us.
It is.
Right. And we're at a time where we really need to not only acknowledge but support and elevate the hurt that people have experienced.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So just kind of really wanting to be able to acknowledge that that's an ongoing, because now, even if it happens outside of my community or, you know, what I consider my tribal affiliations, those things, and I'll give you an example. When the children were being and are being held at the border, that in quote unquote Indian country, we all were immediately impacted with a secondary wave of trauma. These were not quote unquote our people, right? But we understood because we've had that similar experience, and being able to find that place of connection and empathy is part of what may move us to a new place. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to you, Sandra. I think Carmon, you sound like
I wanted to reflect precisely on what you just said, and how with the example that you gave about the separation, right? That it is not about the individuals or the actors, but how a society can repeat something that was harmful, right? Hundreds of years ago, that there is a lot of research about the impact of separations and how a society repeats that. So that is the echo, right? And then it's not about individuals, but then what are those, how those systems of oppression are embedded in the fabric or the laws, the structures of our society, and those are the pieces that we need to dismantle or we need to reflect on, you know, and as in a united way. So I was just reflecting on that. And then as Sandra was saying, that these are difficult conversations and that we have to sit with the discomfort, and that in this presentation, we want to present the perspective of the injuries of historical trauma, but then also the resiliency and survival. And we will get to that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Carmen. Thank you, Sharon. And you know, Sharon, as you were talking, I thought about, again, my mentor, Dr. Joy DeGruy, who talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome. Exactly. So we know what trauma is. She calls it post-traumatic slave syndrome because of the impact that it had on the African-American community. And to the very point you raised, an example that she always gives is talking about two mothers, talking about their children, a white mother, an African-American mother, one mother talking about how well her children, how well her child is doing in school, and the African-American mother says, yes, my child's doing good, but that boy is a mess. Girl, you don't know all the stuff he gets into, which is historical, which is learned. We were taught that was appropriate in a hostile environment, in that you didn't glorify your children's strength. Why? Because they were being sold. So you didn't want to say, yes, my son is strong. No, sir, massa, he weak in the mind, he can't follow direction, to save them. They denigrated them to save them. It wasn't necessarily unlearned. We're still unlearning that, Sharon. We're still, we know we're proud, but it was historical that we denigrated and downgraded the strength for survival. For survival. It's a process we're still unlearning. And again, these are difficult conversations. They're difficult for us. We feel it. I feel it, right? We all feel it. And we're respecting that this is how we get to healing. You cannot heal if you won't acknowledge the injury. And it's difficult. Some would rather not see it, but it's still there. Nevertheless, it is the same. Another thought that I want to leave, that I would want to share with you is, at what point do you have the talk with your children? The talk, I'm not talking about the birds and the bees, that's an important talk, but I am talking about the talk that there are some people who have ideas about who you are just by how you look. It was actually brought up in the presidential debate. The talk is saying how to respond if you're a BIPOC child and you're stopped by the police. What do you say? Where are your hands? Because it could save you. It could save you. And when do you have those conversations? At 10, 11, 12, that's a difficult conversation to have. I've had to have it. And I had to think about, is it too early? When should I show my grandchildren roots? When should I be talking about historical trauma? When should I be talking about our history and our resilience? Because if I talk about the history, then I can talk about the resilience. I'm a miracle to me that I am a product of slavery. And we're still thriving. We're not where we want to be, but we're on a path to get there. So the resilience is incredible. The resilience of the Native American communities are incredible based on our history. I've worked, Carmen, with children who were unaccompanied minors. And to me, that was a story, again, about separation. To Sharon's point, it reminded me of slavery. And they made it. These children made it here with other children. That, to me, is amazing resilience. And I don't even know where it comes from. So what we're capable of, but we have to acknowledge the harm if we're going to get to the healing. Next slide. So, again, so this is ongoing, like Sharon said, the assaults I can't heal if you constantly wounded me. You know, I can try. It's like that, the sore that you get. Well, I always got when I was little, and I would knock off the scab and have to start again. You know, and so that's an ongoing thing that we just want folks to think about, that is happening on a continuous basis. And it's not just to people of color, but to women in general, right? If you're watching the news, we're still being, you know, looked at it and marginalized, and in some cases demeaned. But if I know the history, but books are being taken off the shelf, can't talk about it. How do we make sense to our children is what is happening? Because the alternative is they start thinking it's just about me. It's just me. You know, it's just about me, rather than, no, this is systemic. This is historical. And that's important to help them to thrive, to make sense of trauma. Those of us who are in trauma work, we have to call out the trauma, to acknowledge to the child, it wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault. I work with sex abuse victims, and half of our work is saying, no, you're not responsible. We want to talk, we'll talk about family history, but we don't want to look at American history. We don't want to look at it because it's painful. It's all painful, but we can be resilient, and we are resilient. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but we're going to move to the next slide. And this is Ted Stevenson talking about why we need to acknowledge our history.
I don't believe we're free in America. I think we're haunted by our history of racial inequality. We're burdened by this legacy created by slavery and lynching and segregation. And whether you're born in 2017 or born in 1970 or 1930, you are affected by the environment that we have created by not addressing this history of racial inequality, of being silent. I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it evolved. We had mobs of thousands of people gathering in courthouse yards and fields and doing horrific things to people, and we haven't done anything to acknowledge that. It is American history. And for us to recover from that violence, from that terrorism, we all have to know it, and we have to talk about it. I think it will compel us to think differently about what we need to do to correct the past, to address the past, but also how we make a better future.
Again, that Ted Stevenson, some of you might know Howard Stevenson, which is his brother. And there's an old African proverb, until the lion tells his side of the story, the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay, Carmen.
Hello. So I would like to provide here a definition and a reflection about the topic that we have been discussing, which is what is ethno-racial trauma? And it is defined as the individual and collective psychological and physical distress and fear of danger that results from experiencing or witnessing discrimination, threats of harm, violence, and
Yes.
intimidation directed at ethno-racial marginalized groups. One of the important distinctions is that even though ethno-racial trauma shares some of the similarities with post-traumatic stress disorder, it is a completely different phenomenon from PTSD. In fact, racial trauma is unique and it differentiates from PTSD because, as we have been discussing, it is the result of a socio-political trauma. It is the result of a trauma that has been enabled at a systemic and structural way. So in other words, there is an insidious type of distress that many people of color and other marginalized individuals experience while living in a racist, sexist, and classist society, in a society that is allowing and enhancing and enforcing other systems of oppression. The other reason that is different from PTSD is that, or that it is unique, is that it's related to the cumulative attacks to people who have been minoritized, particularly people of color. And as Sandra has been mentioning, and also Shannon, the way to heal from ethno-racial trauma is not necessarily by implementing evidence-based interventions that could help us at some level, but is really changing the socio-political context. So people, particularly people of color, can wholly achieve the right to heal, grow, and thrive. So at times, some of these structures actually would need to be drastically changed and dismantled. So that is what we would like also to promote or to reflect on, the need to take action and to increase again our awareness about what needs to change at a structural level and how we can unite to work towards liberation. In the next slide, we're going to share with you a video that is actually talking or addressing the aspect about how ethno-racial trauma and historical trauma is not all about trauma, but then that people who have, or people of color, also in the context of historical trauma and in the context of oppression, develop strengths and skills that allow us to thrive and survive. So you are going to watch Dr. Lilian Comas Diaz answering the question about oppression.
This is a well-known fact that because you are at the margins, we people of color, when we get into a discipline or a group, or we bring all the strategies of what is called cultural resilience, which means, you know, not only adapting but also resisting when you have to, fighting when you have to, or not fighting. I mean, is changing, transforming the reality in a way that we have had millennium of years of doing that, because oppression gives you a different vista, it gives you different eyes to begin with. Oppression teaches you to see the connection of different systems, gender, class. You know. Oppression teaches you that your personal survivor is not only important, but the survivor of the community, of the group is important, because you're just one drop of water in this sea. And and I think that's very important, the whole collectivistic approach. And because here in the States we're so individualistic, and that has its place, but when you're dealing with changing a system or fighting oppression,
Yeah.
an army of one does not necessarily does it. Yeah. Let me.
I was eating because I was stressed out, candy bars and chips and donuts, gaining weight. But since I started
So she uses the term cultural resiliency. She talks about collectivism. She talks about how oppression gives people who have been impacted by it a different vista. And then also certain strengths, right, in terms of navigating different worlds. And I know that for many of us who are people of color, we resource to code switching or to, and then she was also talking about how people who have been impacted by oppression know when to respond, when not to respond. So all of those are strategies that allow communities, and particularly, you know, when there is collectivism, communities not only to survive but to thrive. And that is the message that we wanted to communicate with you, that is connected with radical healing, and we will be talking a little bit about radical healing as well. So next we want to invite you to a poll, and before we go into these slides, and Shayna will show us the questions to the poll. Well, I will read the questions. When you work with children and families with whom you share identities, do you find it easier to empathize with their experience, feel a stronger sense of responsibility to help them, experience more intense secondary traumatic stress reactions, experience the same level of secondary traumatic stress reactions as with any other child or family?
In this one, you can choose all that apply. So if more than one answer resonates with you, you can choose more than one.
Okay. Maybe we can see the poll, Shayna. So it looks like in response to the question, when you work with children and families with whom you share identities, most of the participants find it easier to empathize with their experiences. And then the second one is feel a stronger sense of responsibility to help them, experience the same level of secondary traumatic stress as with any other family. And the last one is experience more intense secondary traumatic stress with families who are of different identities. Thank you. So now connecting the reflections that we have been having about racism, historical trauma, and secondary traumatic stress. Racism, oppression, and inequity can contribute to secondary traumatic stress and moral distress, particularly among BIPOC providers. And why is this? So providers who hold marginalized identities might have additional vulnerabilities to secondary traumatic stress due to the fact that they might live in the same communities that the families they are serving live. So they are impacted perhaps by the same inequities. They might have exposure to institutional racism, as similar as the institutional racism their clients are experiencing. They might identify with clients who have a similar background or similar experiences. And it's not unusual, particularly for my experience, for instance, with bilingual providers who have very because of the nature of being bilingual, They might be assigned to very numerous caseloads, and they find themselves with the task of translating for their families, advocating for them, particularly if they are working with undocumented families. And also there is this is silent work that is not recognized or paid. So there is these minority tax that that providers of color and bilingual providers often experience. And then there are usually there are no clear pathways to leadership, particularly for frontline providers. So you need to be more educated or have more degrees to aspire to a position of leadership. And then even if you get to a position of leadership, you might be left alone without the resources or the supports to be able to succeed. So all of that, again, is the result of structural inequities and often too of white supremacy culture. Anything you want to add, Sandra?
You know, Carmen, as you were talking, which is why I love being in the space with all of you, I thought about my work in Phoenix when I was doing investigations. And we didn't have anybody on our staff at that time who spoke Spanish. And I was working with trying to do an investigation of a family who was Spanish speaking, and I had no staff. And asked a secretary, which was, thinking back, was so wrong of me, but we had no one. And she said to me, I can't even say those words. It's not that she didn't know them, but personally, she hadn't been trained. She was, you know, that was very sensitive. You know, you're talking about body parts. And I thought, the issue is not having her do, the issue is we need more staff who can speak Spanish. Right. We need staff who are trained and can understand. And it just brought that to mind because I can remember the look on her face as she told me that. So absolutely the minority tax, is real. The stressors about seeing people going through some of the same things. I think about little things like running groups starting at 5, where the agency where I worked, where people had to take the bus. And then there was a rule, the agency rule, if they're 15 minutes late, they can't participate in the group, which is court mandated, which made no sense. They're coming by bus. And if the bus is late or they miss the bus, they don't get there. Just the systemic things that we ask. I remember taking a mother fuming because the therapist that she was supposed to see didn't see her because she was late. And I said, can I take that case? I asked to, and I'm not trying to glorify myself, but I'm talking about how we build in barriers based on a system that is not culturally responsive.
Yeah. Thank you, Sandra. Next slide, please.
So, and I think that this is all of it, and I hope we all chime in, and what we've all been saying is when we're looking at this, while we're having this conversation, because our identities, Alison's, Shannon's, Carmon, my own, we bring our collective experiences of all of who we are, where we're from, what we've seen, when we were born, to the work. And so we're asking you all participants to think about how you see the world. The chat is proof positive that we have different opinions because we have different experiences. But we want you to consider the way you see the world, how you move, how the world sees you, the way you understand clinical work and the families you work with, and then to check in with yourself, right? How do you feel? How do you feel about who you are? How do you feel about who they are, right? And admit to our own biases, which we all have. And do you have someone that you can debrief with about these issues in a non-threatening manner? Because, and I have to say that because sometimes it's not safe. In these conversations, we say they're not safe, but we do ask you to be brave. Carmon?
I think it's, yeah, I think, yeah, Sandra, thanks. I'm just appreciating what you're saying about safety and about bravery. And because it does take bravery to do this. And the other thing that I wanted to just, we know we're not talking about past experience. We're talking about every day, the work that you do, you're exposed to secondary traumatic stress.
Every day.
You bring your own history with you, and then you are intersecting with other people who then have their stress that combines with, as the empathetic. We get into this because we care.
Yes.
That's why we do the work that we do. And these precious children and families that we're working with, and we care about them. That if we didn't have a reaction, then we know we're in deep, deep trouble, right?
True.
So what are some of the strategies? For me, I think about, I often think about I think about it metaphorically with all the arrows that are coming at us. They're coming at us every day. And these are big things. Like, I live on the res. These things are not going away. They were here when I got there. We're working on them all the time. But there are risk factors that will be like arrows coming at my children and my grandchildren every single day. So while we're trying to eliminate those arrows, take care of those arrows, deal with those arrows, what do we do now to keep those arrows from mortally wounding us? And so we often talk about creating a shield, right? And what is that shield made up of? What strengthens that shield to the point that when those arrows are coming at us, it's not that it's that they bounce off and they don't mortally wound us. They might scratch us. They might do some other things, but they're not going to put us down forever. So some of those things, when we talk about how do you deal with secondary traumatic stress in terms of on an individual basis, it really does have with just those questions that Sandra posed. What is your self-awareness? How are you coming into something, right? To take that time when we talk about practicing self-care, we're not talking about getting your nails done. That's fine. That's wonderful. That can help you out a lot. Do it, go for it. But we're talking about kind of the deeper self-care, not just after an experience. That's kind of reparative. But what are we going to do before we enter in? Even if it's that moment of becoming present, that moment, and it doesn't, sometimes we think it's a whole big thing. And it doesn't take that much time. I mean, we are discovering really the 30-second, 60-second exercise that we can do to bring us in to this space in this moment so that we can have that space for ourselves. And the other thing is finding healthy ways to replenish. We're giving. That's what our, that's why we got here. That's what our job is. And when we know that it's connected to that higher purpose, it can really help our compassion, what they call compassion satisfaction. We have compassion fatigue, and compassion fatigue, let me tell you, is different than burnout, right? Burnout is, I don't ever want to go back. Compassion fatigue is I get up in the morning and I'm thinking about this. I go to bed at night and I'm thinking about this. There is not a time that I put it down. I am so heavy with my compassion that, you know, that's where that fatigue comes from. So, you know, helping to remember your whys and connecting with people to have that balance between work and personal life. I love it when people put their self-care plan together. And of course, it's the last thing on their list that they do after they get their work done. We live in a place where no work is ever getting all done.
That's true.
So what happens? What falls off the plate? You know, and you see it sometimes even in our conferences. We start to talk about self-care when? At the end of the conference. What? What's up with that? So what is the foundation that you're doing? And to really have both, you know, I woke up yesterday and I had two feelings simultaneously that I was identifying for myself. One was I was disheartened. I was feeling disheartened by the conditions and what was happening and some things that are being discussed now that would further erode some advances that we feel like we've made.
Yeah.
And so I was disheartened, but I was also determined. And so finding that place where you can hold space for hope is so critical. And for each one of us to do that back and forth, not just for ourselves, but for each other, it's important, right? And to be able to advocate for yourself, you know, personally and professionally, you know, that it's so hard for us, especially for us that are in leadership positions, to be able to come to a space and say, you know what, I just can't do it today. I am not fit for human consumption. I need to go back to bed. You know, this is, and be able to do that without shame or personal blame.
Yes.
And, you know, and stepping up, if you're in a person in a supervisory or an authoritarian position, or you have a assigned authority position, you know, it is your responsibility. And we'll talk a little bit later about that. I'm going to, next slide, please. We'll hand this over for looking at it kind of, what does it look like in a different environment? So.
Okay. So again, and thank you, Sharon. I have to say, again, I love being in the space with all of you because many times, most times, I leave the space feeling better than what I did when I entered because of people like you. So I just wanted to thank you. And so one size doesn't fit all in terms of how to be resilient. I couldn't tell you how to be resilient, but I want to consider some things in Western culture, in social work, in clinical work. You know, we talk about mindfulness. That's great. That might look different for different people. It may be a woman saying, Jesus, take the wheel. Give me a moment. I got to pray on it. I got to respect that, right? I understand that. That might be her moment. That's her mindfulness. That's his mindfulness. Strength-based stories. I invite you to look at a video by a friend of mine. His name is Jerry Tail. It's called Cultural Healing. And he talks about the prayers of his grandmother, how she would get him up early in the morning to pray. And he said, do I have to get up? Isn't God around all through the day? She got him up early in the morning to pray for things that he said she knew was coming for him, right? Our ancestors have done that. Sometimes that's in our church, our synagogue, the group that we identify with in our neighborhoods. This is also cultural healing, language, movies, walking, songs, because we can all be triggered or feel resilient by songs, you know? And so it's an important part of our experience. It's important for us to realize that it looks different for different people, because I've tried it with some people and they look at me like, I'm not taking no deep breaths. I'm gonna just stop and pray. Whatever works, right? Whatever works is legal. Let me say that. a lot of things may work, might not necessarily be legal. So I want to share that, but to think about and how we help each other with the healing. And so, you know, again, Jerry, please, if you have an opportunity to look at cultural healing, Jerry Theo, and to the person who put in the chat, it is Brian Stevenson. That's my fault. I would like for you to look at their website that he has with his brother called The Lion Story, because they talk about the stories, how the stories heal, how hearing the stories from elders, from ancestors, and how necessary it is for us in the helping profession to also hear the stories. Watch the video. I've had people say, and you know, I can't watch that movie. I'm not gonna watch 12 Years a Slave. That's fine. If that's not for you, then find what moves you, what gives you perspective. I can't dictate that for you, you know, but you do. I watch everything. My husband is a clinical psychologist, and he says, how can you do that? I don't know. I just do it. It works for me. It doesn't work for him, but we're both in the healing business. We do it differently, but we know that I have to be whole to give to. I cannot give anything I don't have, you know. And to Sharon's point, the arrows are constantly coming, poking holes, and the water's draining out, and I got to keep filling it with liquid, right? So that I could be whole. Sharon and Carmen, I'm sure you all have something to say about radical intentional resilience.
Yeah, in the next slides, I will talk a little bit more about radical healing and take a lot of the ideas that Shannon and you have shared into these framework that is really helpful when we think about self-care as a radical act.
Mm-hmm. Can I say one more thing? I work with students and have worked as a field instructor, advisor, and now as an adjunct professor. And I tell my students, one of my classes ends at 9:30, which I hate, p.m. And I always say to them, now I know you want to watch Special Victims Unit. We love it, right? It's probably not the best thing to do. You know, that you have to look at your trauma inputs. I've had students tell me over the years, used to be in the middle of the semester or quarter, I have something to tell you. I was sexually abused. There's mental health issues in my family. We've been homeless. I've had students who experienced both Hurricane Katrina and Sandy, and they have the same stories of our clients, to the point that now I say, if you have the story, if you want to share it with me, you can share it with me. Do your own work. Do your own work. It's a strength to acknowledge that we all bring, which makes us so passionate, right, about the work. But acknowledge that you need to do your own work so that you can be whole, because you will be triggered during this work. Carmen.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So I think this quote by Audre Lorde in a way summarizes or begins to summarize some of the thoughts and reflections shared by Sandra and Shannon. Audre Lorde was diagnosed with cancer, and she, at that time, she wrote a book that where she is actually mentioning or making a difference between being overextended and stretching yourself out, and how, particularly as people of color, we might feel, you know, guilty, or we have the urge to continue in working in fighting and advocating, because if we don't do it, then who else? And she is really talking about the importance of self-care, however you define it, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it. The importance of self-care as an act of as a radical act. So here she says, staying healthy in a system that undermines your very existence is the greatest act of resistance. So in line with these thoughts, we wanted to introduce you very briefly to a framework that is really focusing on the importance of self-care and the importance of radical healing, and particularly the importance of forming connections and cultivating relationships. So the psychology of radical healing is a framework that was created in response to racial trauma in BIPOC individuals and communities. It emerged out of an initiative by a collective of the Society for the Psychological Study of Culture, Ethnicity, and Race, a division of the American Psychological Association. This framework was first described by Dr. Rudolph Valentine in the field of medicine. But when it applies to mental health, is integrating elements of liberation psychology, Black psychology, ethnopolitical psychology, and intersectional theory. And what it highlights is that, or it proposes that it's true that racial and ethnic oppression and violence, along with other systems of oppression like classism, ageism, transphobia, sexism, materializes in health disparities and in limited or life opportunities for BIPOC communities and individuals. Yet, while BIPOCs are collectively affected by oppression and racial trauma, they are not, or we are not defined by these systems of oppression. So it proposes that BIPOC individuals have not only, and communities have not only resisted to oppression for centuries, but contributed to freedom, contributed to democracy. And it highlights that BIPOC communities are rich in strengths, rich in the form of family, cultural traditions, non-dominant bodies of knowledge, ancestral knowledge, bravery, and victory, and resistance. In the next very short clip, Dr. Wisdom Powell is defining what is radical healing. In here, it says that in essence, radical healing involves the personal and collective actions that promote living a life with dignity and respect. Such a life necessitates freedom from all forms of oppression. So radical healing in psychology involves becoming or being a whole to face identity-based wounds. And we have talked about what those identity-based wounds are. It also incorporates strategies that address the root causes of identity wounds and of trauma by building on the strengths of individuals and communities and engaging in those communities in a recognition or reconnection with ancestral practices, with ancestral knowledge as ways to promote resiliency. If we think about, Shannon was just sharing with us how she is going to go away and engage in this narrative exercise. And, you know, like when we think about healing circles or intergenerational storytelling, how can we incorporate that into the work that we do? And that all of these strategies are working to change the current manifestation in deep wounds of historical and contemporary injuries. It also pushes the boundaries of conventional healing practices that are focused on the individual, and with symptom reduction interventions that are really teaching people how to accommodate to injustice and is really focusing on helping people identify their strengths so they can work for liberation. So in the next slide, or in the next video, Dr. Powell will talk more about historical, radical healing.
First want to say that
about radical healing.
So I first want to say that the gift of the framework for radical healing has come from many different sort of disciplines. And I first want to lift up the names of Sean Gimwright of the Radical Healing Collective, led by Dr. Helen Neville, and Dr. Rudolph Valentine, who wrote about radical healing from a medical point of view. And at its simplest element, radical healing is about wholeness, right? It's about this move towards reconstituting, reconfigurating, and really reclaiming those lost parts of ourselves that have been fragmented, the things we've lost in the fire. Radical healing is also about cultivating a critical consciousness and self-awareness about the wounds that we've been talking about. It's about naming and claiming those wounds in an authentic and real way. It's not about pretty words and about making people feel better, but about really unearthing all of the ways in which these wounds that we've experienced have essentially torn us apart. And if you think about the body as a metaphoric possibility, and the way we go about modern westernized medicine, we have a cardiologist over here who takes care of your heart, a dermatologist who looks after the skin. You might have a nephrologist who looks over your kidney functioning. But all of those are part of one body. And in similar ways, I would argue that our approaches to resolving the COVID-19 pandemic and the structural racism that operates with it to create this powerful syndemic, that the ways we've been going about this work has been in a fragmented nature. And that is why radical healing is what's needed. Radical healing pushes us towards healing-centered approaches, not just sort of talking about the traumas that we've experienced, because we all have been collectively traumatized. And I think that's important to lift up, because often sometimes it's hard for people to bridge those deepened empathy gaps because they don't think that the issues are about them. But I'm here to say that actually radical healing is a collective process. It recognizes that it takes all of us really to get to the other side of this, and that in order to achieve that, we have to come together in ways that we may not have thought about. Now, I am an artist as well as an academic, and I've always felt that those two things go together, that your left brain and your right brain need to connect to develop novel solutions. And in similar ways, we need to be developing policies and practices and procedures that don't simply help us cope with the moment, but actually move us towards healing, growing, and thriving, because thriving is the north, really, of radical healing. I mean, that's the radical nature of what has to happen. We have to move aside the ways that we've been doing things. What a tragedy it would be if we came out of this moment on the other side doing things the same way we've always done them, in disconnected, fragmented ways. And so in this moment, at this time, what we need most to speak to the wounds of our nation, to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, is for all of our systems, sectors, policies, practices, and procedures to be interconnected in ways that allow us to speak to and care for the whole person, the whole community, and our whole nation.
Thank you. Next slide.
Well, there you go. You dropped the mic on that. That was.
Next slide, please. I know that I have run out of time, so I will be very brief. As you could hear Dr. Powell, the aim of radical healing is to promote collaboration and action among, in our case, mental health providers, and in mental health practices that integrate a strength-based approach, that honor cultural traditions, that moves beyond the individual to the collective, that encourages critical thinking about the structures that shape our lives, the lives of our society, and that supports BIPOC communities to take action and to develop a sense of agency. The radical healing framework has 6 anchors that are described here, and you can explore them. I don't have time to go over each one of them, but I just to highlight how practicing restorative self-care strategies is one of these anchors. And then also that the work starts with the self and with this critical awareness of our own biases, of our own contributions to oppression, and then how we can change, so then we can contribute to a change in society. And you will have the link to an article where each one of these anchors is described at length. Next slide, please. So I just want to do a check-in with my group, and I am wondering if we are doing this exercise. Yes?
I think we were going to invite people, since they have the copy of the slides, to do this on their own. Just in the interest of time, we want to make sure we get to some of the supervisory and organizational strategies in a few minutes for questions.
Okay. So in holding the framework of radical healing in mind, and we have been talking about self-care, but self-care can mean different things for each one of us. And when we think about self-care, there is our personal history, how we understand it from a sociocultural perspective, and then what works for us. So we want to invite you to consider these questions as you think about self-care and come up with a strategy so you can engage in radical healing. So you can take action and do something that is different so you can protect yourself, so you can continue doing the work. Thank you.
So we just,
So
go ahead, Shannon.
this is just a little offering. People can look at, these are 3 different samples of kind of individual assessments that you can do for yourself. And each one of them kind of reflects back to what was being said about, looking at ourselves as whole human beings. So looking at our mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being, that they're all connected. So these are just on your own, something that you could do, and we're gonna move right along.
So another thing we want to invite you to do again on your own, and making sure those connections, so forming those connections, making sure you have people that you can talk to, a safe space to process all of this. And so, again, I encourage you to take a look at the suggestions and continue to kind of reflect as well as connect on your own. Next slide, please. All right, Carmen, did you want to touch on a few of the supervisory strategies?
Yes. So one of the I think that, just to summarize some of the strategies, one of the points that I want to highlight, I was mentioning before how in general in the field of mental health, and particularly in the field where I am, that it's infant and early childhood mental health, supervisors traditionally have had a lot of power, and then the majority of supervisors have been historically white people. So when we think about supervision, is very important to think from a place of equity and anti-racism, and start with from that place of self-awareness. And identify how as supervisors we can share power how we can engage in a true collaborative in parallel process with our supervisees. And one of the very concrete strategies is to start with a commitment to self-location, for the supervisor to model that, and also to engage in a process of learning more about if you are supervising someone who is from a different ethnicity and or has different identities than you in terms of race, gender identity, but particularly as we were talking about the impact of secondary traumatic stress on BIPOC individuals, how is our responsibility as supervisors to learn more about what those impacts could be on the person, and not expect that the person is going to teach us. And I am choosing to mention that as as a person of color, as an immigrant, I was often in a place where I had to explain myself and actually teach my colleagues or my supervisors about the inequities that the families that I was working with were experiencing, and then I was also at times experiencing. So how, again, this is a collective responsibility, and in the effort to change structural inequities and oppression. So that is the most important reflection for me. I'm wondering if the rest of you, my colleagues, will like to share a strategy.
I think you've covered it for me, Carmen. And I want to honor the questions or summary. So I pass.
We can move on to the organizational strategies. Yeah, I appreciate that, Carmon Rosa. I know there's so much rich content there, but you did a great job of summarizing that. And I think for organizations, again, making sure your supervisors have the training and knowledge that they need to provide this support. Oftentimes that is lacking. So if you are a leader or a manager or director, really thinking about what kind of training are we offering? Are we giving our supervisors both to address secondary trauma, but also to address these intersectionalities and provide that support and have those brave conversations that aren't always comfortable. So that requires some training. We also want to look at, diversifying our workforce and making sure that we are looking to make sure that we don't just have that one bilingual provider who gets all the multilingual cases, right? And making sure that our staff kind of culturally fits the population that we're serving. Also making sure we're creating these safe spaces for everybody in the organization, that we know that there's no one way of responding. If there's a crisis, we're not assuming that everyone responds in the same way or wants the same kind of support. Not kind of promoting this Eurocentric viewpoint, really asking staff what they need, allowing them to cope in the way that most comfortable for them, and that helps them heal. We also want to allocate resources for translation, interpretation, right? Not putting that all on our few staff members who may be bilingual. There also are some organizational assessments. So in addition to looking at your organization through a secondary traumatic stress lens, wanting to look at your organization through diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. And next slide, please, just to kind of give you some examples. You can check these out. These are all free assessments that you can use for your organization to really look at how well you're doing and maybe highlight areas where you could improve. Next slide, please. All right, so we're just going to invite you, kind of a call to action, practice some of the radical self-care that we've been learning about, both reflecting for yourself and thinking about what you need to take care of yourself, and not to feel bad about doing that, right? You can't help others if you're not helping yourself. So really taking the time to attend to yourself so you can keep fighting the good fight. Oh, sorry, you can go back, please, to the other items. Yeah. So does anyone else want to step in to talk about the other calls to action?
I just wanted to, because I don't know if we have time for, but one, thank you for allowing me to be in this space. And I want to borrow shamelessly from Amanda Gorman and my message to all of you, because we're in this together, right? One, if you want an old African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, let's go together. And I hope we go together. Amanda Gorman, for there's always light. If only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it. I thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. And I think that, you know, number 4 just highlights for me one of the questions that came up in the Q&A. If you're a bystander, you know, what can you do? You don't want to participate in oppression. And I think that number 4 kind of highlights our role. If you do have power or privilege in any way, you know, you have a responsibility to use it, right? To fight system injustices, you know, call out those inequities when you're seeing them, do something, right? Not just to stand and watch. So do what is within your power to join the fight, to not just be an ally, to be a co-conspirator, to really get involved. And that can be challenging, but, you know, that is one recommendation. And I don't know if others would have another response to that question, but it just kind of reminded me.
I think I just want to say sometimes we get really complicated because it's big. It's, you know, yes, you know, as people were saying in the chat, you know, this is, you know, what about the system? What, you know, yes, we have big things that, you know, organizational policy, all of those kinds of things that must change because they are the foundation of systemic racism, right? They're baked into our organizations, they're baked into our systems. And so, you know, yes, we have to stand in those brave spaces, but there's also the simplicity of just doing things differently on an individual basis. Right. So, you know, I'll give you an example. I've shared it here, is that one of the most powerful kind of experiences that I saw was in a community where when people came into their agency for help, the first thing that they did was they gave them a glass of water. The second thing that they did is they called them by a relative term. They were not client, they were sister, brother, auntie, uncle, niece, nephew. Immediately, a sense of belonging. Absolutely. A sense of we're in this together. So, you know, when you think about the big picture, yes, but don't negate the power that you have in the moment. Absolutely. And so, so thanks for letting me be a part of this conversation as well.
Great.
I just want to thank all of you for being with us today and for sharing your wisdom, your experiences. It really has been, it's shed light, to your point. And I think one of the things that, as I've watched the chat and all the feels that are there, whenever we start these conversations, it does really elicit so many different powerful feelings. Absolutely. And I think even my personal experience in this, I'm sure, is what leaders across CACs across the country deal with. How do we do this? And there were a lot of people chiming in about what you should do, maybe try this, maybe try. But at the same time, what we're trying to do is, to your point, how do we go here together? How do we support each other? How do we lift each other's voices? And I just love Maya Angelou, who says, you know, when you know better, do better. That's true. And what all of you have helped us today is to help us to know better so that we can go forth and do better. So thank you for that. I think it's been just an incredible, powerful webinar. Just a couple of questions. We don't have but just a couple of minutes left. Look at all these wonderful resources that you have available to you. Really encourage you to do those. Just one quick question here is somebody, Olivia says, I work mostly with young adults, 17 to 25. Do you have any book recommendations or resources I can point my young adults to?
Can we send those to her, because they come to mind? I can't think of the correct names. I don't want to give out, you know, faulty information or links, but can we get back to you? Because that is, you know, a very good question.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. No problem at all. No problem at all. So I think the only other question, I think it was answered though in the chat. Any other questions that people have in just the 2 minutes we have left? Anything I missed, panel?
No.
All right. Well, guys, thank you so much. Thanks all our participants for being here for this really important discussion. So obviously we have some more work to do, but thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today.
I think